Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, Pepe. Okay, the title of the talk is the default mode network. There is a subtitle, it's the neural dynamic and neural circuit of the brain during resting state and in health and disease. A very interesting discussion about the brain function take out during the first years of the last century between Charrington and Brown. For Charrington, for Charrington, the father of the reflex system, the activity of the brain is principally driven by the momentary demand of the environment. So, in other words, for Charrington, the brain operates at the same form than the reflex system. But in the 20 last years, and principally for the discovery of the resting state network, our view of the brain changed dramatically, principally for two reasons. The first reason is related with we know today that in any attention-demanding goal-directed task, we have pattern of cerebral activation, but also concurrent suppression of some brain regions. And the second reason is that during the spontaneous activity during the resting state is organized in multiple specific functional anatomical network called resting state network. It's interesting that because this view of the brain is not new. For Brown was a student of Charrington. The brain function is largely determined by the intrinsic or spontaneous activity. For him, the nervous system is composed by an intrinsic activity with a rhythmicity that is disturbed by the reflex system. So the brain for him is not like the reflex system, it's completely different. The first study that showed that some brain areas showed a decrease during the different goal-directed tasks was this in the 97. By chance, the author discovered that some region of the medial prefrontal cortex and some region of the medial parietal cortex, this is the posterior cingulate and this is the medial prefrontal cortex, show a decrease in the metabolic activity during different visual search tasks, during a set of different visual search tasks. The first interpretation of this result was 1 year later, in the 98. This interpretation was by Mesulam in this very interesting review. For Mesulam, the region that showed the deactivation during any goal-directed task probably are the regions that have a transmodal activity in contrast with regions that have that unimodal activity. The unimodal region for Mesulam are related with the sensory and motor processing, and the transmodal region are the region related with the internal representation of the world. We can see in this article of Mesulam, for him, the transmodal area in the medial temporal cortex, in the Wernicke area, in the hippocampal entorhinal cortex, and in the posterior parietal cortex provide critical gateway for transforming perception into recognition, word form into meaning, scene in event into experience, and spatial location into target for exploration. Some years later, in the 2001, this was the first article that described the default mode network as a network. It's a very important work in the history of the neuroscience. It's a very, very cited work. And the group of Marcus Reichel showed that the brain region that showed a deactivation, a metabolic deactivation during any goal-directed task are the region with the highest metabolic consumption during the rest, okay? And also he showed that the region that showed this characteristic had a very high connectivity, functional connectivity. You can see this is the amount of paper related with this domain during the last year. Today we have more than 10,000 papers related with the default mode network. And it's very interesting because today, for us, the before the discovery of the default network, for many researchers, the brain is implicitly inactive in absence of environmental stimuli. Today, for us, the brain is always active, irrespective of environmental stimuli. In the same way, the rest today is reconfigured into an active psychological state. Even in a very simple visual search task, you can see the deactivation of the default, the metabolic deactivation, and the activation of the dorsal attention and the ventral attention network task. You can see here. And also another characteristic, here you can see the very high functional connectivity between the principal node of the default network. Here you can see in this is the metabolic activity during 5 minutes of rest. You can see in yellow the metabolic activity of the posterior cingulate cortex. This is the X. You have 300 seconds. And in orange, you can see the metabolic activity of the medial prefrontal cortex. And you can see that the both lines are the same. So you have a very, very, very high functional connectivity during the time. And you can see also the anticorrelation between the principal node of the default network with another region. For example, in this case, it's the IPS, interparietal sulcus, and this region is part of the dorsal attention network. You can see the anticorrelation. Another main characteristic of the default is that some areas of the default are activated during internal tasks, for example, during the memory, during the prospection, or during theory of mind. So during different forms of self-projection. And if for many studies, we can conclude that our performance in any one goal-directed task is not only related with activation of the dorsal and sensory region, but is related in the anti-correlation between internal and external networks. In the same line, before the discovery of the default, the variability in behavior and perception was related with the noise, for example, during a task. Today, we have many, many reports in which we show that the variability in behavior and perception is modulated by the endogenous fluctuation. As a first summary, we can say that the default network is one of the most widely studied intrinsic connectivity networks. The principal nodes are the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex. These regions are activated in absence of tasks. These regions are involved in autobiographical planning. The activity of this region are positively related to mind wandering. But what is the biological substrate of the default network? This is a very interesting phylogenetic tree of the cortical mantle, done by Wagner and Krien in 2013 of the mammals. And you can see that you can see two principal results in this representation of the phylogenetic tree of the cortical mantle. First is that the position of the motor, auditory, and visual area persists along the evolution across the mammal. But the size of the primary sensory or motor cortex is very, very different. So you can see in our case, the size of the primary motor, visual and auditory representation is very, very small related with other mammals. And we can see too, specifically in the primate evolution, we can see that the representation of the motor or sensory, visual or auditory brain area are the same. So you have exactly the same size of the same relative, not relative size between the visual and motor and visual auditory areas. But the multisensory and the transmodal areas are very, very different. So in human, we have, in our case, we have a high representation of the transmodal areas. And this is the comparison related with the chimpanzee. We have a very similar brain to the chimpanzee. Another characteristic of the transmodal and unimodal area is the connective profile. In the transmodal area, we have a connective profile, a very distant connective profile. So the fiber of the area in the transmodal area are very long, related with the fiber in the unimodal areas. And we have also a great variability in myelinization in the transmodal area across subject. And another important, interesting point, this is a new result of the last year, doing with the connectome data with many subjects. So for this article, the author takes 800 subjects in fMRI. And we can see that these transmodal areas that share the position of the DMN, the default model, are equidistant of the primary area. So if we take one of the principal node of the default model or this transmodal area, it's important to say that the position of the transmodal area under the DMN share. We can see that this point are equidistant with the primary sensory motor areas. And this is a meta-analysis. We can see that the transmodal area are related with tasks, which are related with internal representation of the world. With this new result, we can see that the DMN is at a maximal distance from systems involved in perception and action in both functional connectivity and analytical space, indicating that neural activity in this region is likely to be similar, insulated from direct environmental input. We can see that the location of the DMN as equidistant from the sensory and motor system is aligned with its broad range of functions that require integration between multiple sensory systems, including episodic memory and semantic memory, social cognition, etc. And the two canonical features of the DMN related with abstraction, stimulus independence, and content heterogeneity can be accounted for by its position at the end of a topographical hierarchy that is equidistant from unimodal system. But there are many outstanding questions or future questions related with the DMN. The first question can be related with we don't know the electrophysiological signature of the large-scale network. So we need to see, because most of the study related with the default and the dorsal temperature are related with the fMRI. We don't know the effect of the neurochemical modulation on large-scale network, for example, the dopaminergic or noradrenergic modulation of the network. And the third very important question is related with how do the 7 large intrinsic connective networks map onto striatal, thalamic, and cerebral connectivity circuits, so which is the modulation of this network related with the subcortical structures. For the first question, we did an experiment with intracortical EEG in collaboration with the Grenoble Hospital in France. You can see with this technique, the intracortical EEG, you have a very nice temporal and spatial resolution related with the fMRI. With the fMRI, you have a very nice spatial resolution, but the temporal resolution is very poor. It's not the best. You have 1.2 seconds. Here you have 1.5 milliseconds. It's very different. And here we know exactly the position of the electrode. This is not ECOG, it's the intracortical EEG. For each patient, we have between 10 and 15 electrodes. Each electrode has between 10 and 15 contacts. This is a representation of one electrode, and each contact is the distance between two contacts is 3 millimeters. Normally, we have the 125 28 recording sites by patient during 2 weeks. During the 2 weeks, we can do many different attentional tasks. This is a quickly representation of what we can do with the data. This is intracortical EEG signal, and today I will present you the simplification of the signal with the Hilbert transformation, in which we can see the amplitude of in this case of the gamma band activity. This is a task. This is a visual search task. It's an adaptation of a classical visual search task developed by Anne Prisman. The patient needs to find the gray letter T as fast as possible. There are two conditions. This is the pop-out condition. This is the very easy condition. And this is the classical visual search, in which the target has the same color than the distractor. The patient needs to find as fast as possible the letter. And they have 3 seconds. This is the windows in order to find the target. We did first fMRI, this task in fMRI with 20 control subjects in order to see which are the regions related with the process during this task. And you can see a huge difference between this is the activation during the difficult condition, during this condition in bold, and this is the activation during the pop-out condition. So you can see a big difference between the brain region, the metabolic activity during this task. So you have a nice activation, metabolic activation in the dorsal attention network, in the dorsolateral frontal cortex, in the frontal head field, in the APS, only in the third condition, and in the pop-out condition you have only an activity in the visual cortices. This is current with the literature of the visual search task. For many researchers, only in this kind of task you need the top-down modulation. And in this kind of task, you need only a very quickly pop-out modulation for to do a correct response. But this is the response with the intracortical EEG. We have principally three kinds of response. This is each line is a trial. The trial are sorted in function of the reaction time. So this is the reaction time. This is the reaction time for the pop-out condition. And this is the reaction time for the difficult condition. And we have 3 kinds of gamma band response. In this case, you have principally in many, you can see in red this kind of response. This is a gamma band activity, a transient gamma band activity, and this is the onset of the visual search. In this kind of electrode, you have the electrode in the visual cortex and in the temporal cortex. You can see here the amount of electrode across the patient. So we did the same task in 27 patients. So in totally we have 3,000 electrode contacts across the patient. So we have we have electrodes in all the brain. We have many electrodes with this kind of response, in which the duration, the latency, the duration of the gamma response is not related with the reaction time, but is evoked by the presentation of the stimuli, and it's very quickly the latency related with the onset of the stimuli. We have also this kind of transient response, but this response is not related with the presentation of the stimuli, but is related with the button press, this is the transient motor gamma band activity, and you can see that most of the electrodes that show this kind of response are in the motor cortex. You can see the electrode in yellow. And this is the most interesting response because in this kind of electrode, you can see here in blue the electrode with this kind of response, the duration of the gamma band response is related with the duration of the reaction time. So if the patient found the target very quickly, you have a very quickly gamma band activity. But if the patient take, I don't know, 2 seconds in order to find the target, you have you have a very, very long duration of the gamma band response. Most of the contact with this kind of response is a sustained gamma band activity are in the prefrontal areas, and also you have some electrons in the parietal and visual areas. But it's very interesting because you have, for example, this is one electrode in the dorsolateral frontal cortex. This is one electron in the anterior cingulate cortex. This is in the frontal left field, and this is in the parietal cortex. But you can see that for the visual cert case and for the pop-out case or efficient or inefficient case, you have the same kind of response. It's not like the fMRI result. It's very different to the fMRI result. As conclusions for this study, in most of the frontal side, the difference between efficient and inefficient visual cert is related to the temporal extension of the neural processing and not in the mechanism. So we have exactly the same mechanism. This is a sustained gamma band activity. And difference in bold activation may be related with the temporal boundaries of underlying neural processing, because this response is very, very quickly related with the resolution of the ball. This is the representation of the gamma band activity across the patient during the easy visual cert task, and this is for the difficult one. Here you have the time, and in red you have the brain areas with a significant gamma band activity across the patient, and obviously you can see that an activation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. You can see an activation in the visual cortex. You can see that the duration of between both brain areas are related with the difficulty of the task. In this case, this is the difficult task. This is for the easy one. You can see the duration of the activity is related with the difficulty of the task, of course. But you can also see that some brain areas show a deactivation. The deactivation is shown in blue in this case. Okay. So during the task, you have an activation in the dorsolateral area. You have an activation in the visual areas, but you have a huge deactivation of the gamma band activity in the medial prefrontal area, in the precuneus or posterior cingulate cortex. You have a deactivation in the temporal lobe, in the pole. You have a deactivation also in the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. This is the deactivation of the gamma band. You can see this is a broadband gamma band deactivation, and you can see this deactivation in all the region related with the default band network, not only in the ventrolateral frontal cortex. This is the deactivation for the easy for the difficult condition in the ventrolateral frontal cortex. This is in the medial prefrontal cortex. This is in the medial frontal gyrus. This is in temporal parietal junction, and this is in the posterior cingulate cortex. So you can see the deactivation, the induced deactivation of the gamma band. Interestingly, the deactivation of the gamma band activity is fit perfectly with the region with deactivation in the metabolic activity that form part of the default band network. But the difference is that here we have the timing of the deactivation. You can see, for example, here for the difficult condition, in red, you have the deactivation across 2 seconds for the difficult task, and you have the deactivation for the easy condition for the easy task, for the efficient condition. And you can see the same for another region. And you can see also the onset of the deactivation is not the same. That you have first a deactivation in the lateral part of the default, and you can see after 500 milliseconds a deactivation in the classical node of the default, in the posterior cingulate and in the medial prefrontal cortex. So you have first a deactivation in the lateral part of the default, and after you have a deactivation in the medial part of the default. And also you can predict the reaction time in function of the level of deactivation. So you can see the deactivation, for example, in the medial prefrontal cortex, or the deactivation in the ventrolateral frontal cortex. The trial in which the patient are most, the response of the patient is quickly, you have a greater deactivation, rated with the trial with the slowest response. For the second question, if we can find an effect in the neurochemical modulation of the large-scale network, when I come back to Chile there 4 years ago, I started a collaboration with Francisco Goiti, an expert in language and in attention. We started a collaboration in order to study the ADHD. The ADHD is a highly prevalent neurodevelopmental condition. In Chile, we have a record related with the ADHD. We have 10% of the children are related with this syndrome, with this disorder. The ADHD is characterized by the inattention and impulsivity or hyperactivity. The symptoms persist into the adulthood in a majority of the patients, and these patients have an increased risk of depression, substance abuse, and antisocial behavior. And most interesting, there are many articles that show that in this kind of patient, there is a dysfunctional modulation of the default mode network. Most of the patients are treated with this kind, with noradrenergic or dopaminergic reuptake inhibitor. Like this is the classical Ritalin, or with this kind of medication which is specific with noradrenaline. Interestingly, the noradrenaline or norepinephrine and the dopamine are implicated, of course, in attention. The noradrenaline is very related with the alerting, and the dopamine is very related with the executive control. One of the characteristics of the ADHD is the reaction time variability. For the control, you have this kind of variation of the reaction time across the subject. This is the distribution. But in ADHD, you have another distribution. The name of this distribution is an X-Gaussian. You have the same kind of distribution in this part of the curve, but you have a very different distribution in the end of the curve. For many specialists in the ADHD, this part of the curve is related with the interruption of the default mode network in the dorsal attention network. And this a new model related with the mind wandering, and the author relate the activity of the locus coeruleus noradrenergic system with different kind of behavioral variability between on task, on focus, or mind wandering. I don't know if you know, but the locus coeruleus is the principal site for the brain synthesis of norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and it's very interesting because we can see the activity of the locus coeruleus. If we see the pupil diameter, this is a classical paper of Aston Jones. Here you have the activity of the locus coeruleus, and here you got the dilation of the pupil dilation, and you can see that a dilation of the pupil diameter is related with the high activity of the locus coeruleus. The Aston Jones proposed this model in which there is a relationship between the performance and the locus coeruleus activity. For him, if the activity of the locus coeruleus is very low, probably the animal of the subject is in an inattentive or non-alert state, and the performance is very bad. In the other extreme, if the activity of the locus coeruleus is very high, probably the animal is in an exploratory state or distractible state. Then the best performance probably is related with the middle activity of the locus coeruleus, in which the patient or the subject are in a task engaged or in an exploitative state, in which you have a very nice transient response related with the stimuli and important stimuli for the animal or for the subject. There are many papers related with the activity of the pupil dilation. Is not only related with the visual characteristic of the image, but it's more related with the attentional component of the image. For example, this is a classical study of in the 79. in which we can see this is the pupil diameter for doing a multiplication. This is the dilation related with the presentation of the multiplicand, and this is the dilation related with the multiplier. You can see that if the multiplication is very hard, you have this is your pupil diameter. So during the time in which you are calculating the response, your pupil is very dilated. But if the multiplication is very easy, this is the response of the pupil. Interestingly, here the psychophysic characteristic of the multiplicand and the multiplier are the same, but the response of the pupil is very, very difficult. And this is a recent paper in Europe in which it's very interesting. Here you have the sensory activity. This is the auditory sensory activity. You can see and here you have the locomotion velocity of the rat. And here you have the pupil diameter. And you can see that, of course, during the locomotion activity of the animal, you can see an increase in the sensory activity. And you have also a sustained dilation of the pupil. But more interesting are their microstate. You can see that there are many attentional microstate or sensory microstate during the rest period of the rat. You can see that the velocity of the rat in this case is 0, but you can see that the pupil diameter can account the moment in which the activity of the sensory region are more activated. That it's a very good indicator of this kind of arousal period. This is the task. It's a very difficult task. It's a visual spatial working memory task. The patient need to remember the position of the dots. This is the difficult condition. In this condition, the patient need to remember 6 dots across the time. So in this case, you present the first array. You need to remember the position. After you have a second array, you need to remember the position of the 2 dots of the second array, and you need to remember also the position of the first array. In this case, you need to remember the position of the new 2 dots, and you need to remember the position 2 of the other 4 dots. So in this case, you need to remember 6 dots. For the easy condition, you need to remember only 3 dots. So you have 1 dot for each array. After that, you have a distractor. The distractor can be task-related, can be neutral, can be emotional, or sometimes you have nothing. You have no distractor. And finally, you have the probe. And the probe, you need to respond if the dot of the probe was present or not in the previous array. This is a very difficult task. We did the task with 50 children between 10 and 12 years old. And the 25 ADHD patient did the task twice, without and with medication, randomly. Okay. This is the performance of the children without the medication. You have each point is a patient, and this is are the same patient but with medication. And this is the performance of the control subject. And here you have the performance for each subject for the high and low condition. So for many subjects, for 95% of the subjects, they have a better response for the easy one and a worse response for the difficult condition. But you have 2 subjects in which the patient, in which you have a better response for the difficult condition. I don't know why. This is the pupil diameter during 3 trials. Each line presents one part of the task. This is the first array, the second array, the third array. This is the distractor, and this is the probe. And you can see this is the pupil response. So this is the response for the first array, second, third for the distractor, and this is the response for the probe. Here you have a second trial in which you have exactly the same modulation of the pupil diameter. This is the response for the first array, second, third, proof, distractor and proof, and this is for the third array. If we did an average across the subject, we can see that. In blue, you have the pupil dilation for the ADHD group across the trial, across the task. This is the first array, the second array, the third array, this is the distractor, and this is the proof. In red, you have the pupil diameter response, the pupil diameter for the control group. Interesting, you have here in green the response for the medicated group. And this is for each subject, you have the peak in zeta score for the pupil diameter during this period of the task. You can see that the medicated patient had exactly the same response than the control, and this response is different to the unmedicated patient. After that, we related the classical behavioral measure of any task. This is the variation of the reaction time. This is the performance. And you can see that for the ADHD group, you have this relationship between the variability of the reaction time and the performance. This is normal. This is so for example, for this patient, you have a very high variability in the reaction time, and you have a very, very bad performance. And for this patient, you have you don't have a great variability in the reaction time. You have a very, very good response. But interestingly, this is the relationship between the index of the pupil response during the probe and the variability of the reaction time, and it is the relationship between the pupil response and the performance. And you can see the relationship between the two index for the ADHD group, and you can see the difference between the relationship between when the patient are medicated or or for the control group. And this, you have the same, but how is the change of the pupil diameter or performance for each subject treated with the medication? These results are very interesting because we know today that probably the ADHD is related with this regulation between the phasic and tonic catecholaminergic response, cognitive response. And this is in accord with the recent literature of the ADHD. Finally, a summary. We have the pupil diameter was strongly modulated by the task. Only in control and medicated patients, there is a strong temporal relationship between the peak of the pupil diameter and the appearance of the proof. It is possible to modulate the tonic pupil diameter response with the treatment in most of the patients. And finally, this is the first direct evidence, to the best of our knowledge, of a treatment modulation of the ADHD in the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system during a high-level attentional task that could serve as a substrate for more future basic research and putative clinical and diagnostic application. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomas. I was wondering on your recording from the intracranial electrodes, whether you were able to also record eye movements and whether you look into the relationship between the eye movements and the signals.
Yeah. So we have in this one we are doing analysis in the anti-correlation between the gamma band activity and the gamma band deactivation, in order to, if we can predict or not for example, the reaction time of the performance of the subject. For instance, we have the correlation of across many different electrodes of the same network during different periods of rest. So we have, for example, for the resting state, the patient needs to rest for 5 minutes with the eye closed. We have, I don't know, it's a very high correlation, for example, between the gamma band activity of the precuneus and the medial prefrontal cortex. But if the patient does an internal task, you have a correlation very, very high related with the resting state period. So you can increase the correlation across distant electrode in function of the internal demand of the patient. In this moment, we are doing this task, the last task, the Stenberg task in the patient. So we need, with intracortical EEG and with eye tracker. So we're very excited in order to see how is the relationship between the pupil diameter and the deactivation and activation of the different nodes of the large scale network.
Thank you, Tomás. Beautiful. I'm just going to, follow up on Pedro's talk. So, isn't also the pattern of my eye movements disturbed in kids with ADHD, and therefore, how much that explains the alterations in the pupil dilation that you are observing? So, I'm trying to get at: is this a hallmark, or is it because we are observing already other deficits, such as, for instance, in eye movements?
So this is a good question. We have many differences between patient and control. For example, we have difference related with the blinks during the task. Normally, for the controls, all the blinks are at the end of each trial. For example, for the patient, we have blinks during the trial, and finally we have not the same number of trials between group, because we need to create the trial with many blinks. But in this case, the presentation of the task is in the center of the screen, very in the center of the screen. That there are only 2 degrees between each one of the extreme of the array. And during the task, we don't have saccade. So we had the only micro saccade. The task is very, very quickly. If you have if you did a saccade during the task, probably it's impossible to remember the position of the dot. But I don't know.
I'm specifically thinking of, if you think that every eye movement refresh the image and therefore gets like an attentional boost. Mm-hmm. If kids have an alteration in their eye movement patterns, then therefore they may actually also be performing worse, mm-hmm, because of the cost in terms of attention that the saccades actually cost, and not necessarily because of the pupil dilation that you're measuring. So that's what I'm trying to understand whether this is 2 different mechanisms. Yeah. It's just one and the same.
So, for instance, we have the more interesting point is not the average across the group, but is the difference of for each one of the subject. For example, here we have the delta in performance across the subject related with the treatment, and here you have the delta of the pupil diameter response related with the treatment. So we have a group. We have a group with a very, very good performance without treatment, so without medication. In this group, there are no difference between in the pupil diameter when the patient did the task with or without the treatment. But in this group of patients, we have a very, very nice difference between the pupil response and between the performance during the task. This is a good indicator of the relationship between the effect of the modulation of the system and the effect of the performance in the patient. Of course, we have many different control situations in order to see. For example, we did the task without the memory components. So if you see the array, but if you see the array without without memorization of the position of the dot, you have nothing. You have exactly the same response for the proof than for the previous array. You don't have you don't have this kind of of response. You have exactly the same kind of response than here. So effectively, this very, very, very big response of the pupil diameter is related with the attentional part of the task, and the proof is the most important part of the task in this kind of working memory task.
No more questions. All right, thank you.